Have you ever noticed how obsessed we are with the image of a dead bride? Even if you haven't thought about it directly, you've seen her. The pale skin, the closed eyes, flowing white dress. Maybe she's holding flowers. Maybe she's wearing a veil. She shows up in horror films, old photos, even Halloween decorations. But what if I told you that image didn't come from fiction? What if I told you it came from real women, laid to rest in wedding dresses, not because they made it to the altar, but because they never got the chance? And in some of those tragic cases, the worst part wasn't that they died before they could say, "I do." It's that they weren't even dead yet. Tonight, we're talking about women in history, dressed in lace, sealed in coffins, and sometimes silenced too soon. So let's get into it. Let's start with the story of Octavia Hatcher, one of the most famous and most tragic figures from the late 1800s. Octavia was a young woman in Pikeville, Kentucky, who had just lost her infant son. Stricken with grief, she fell into a deep depression, then suddenly became ill and slipped into a coma. Days passed. She didn't wake up. And with the oppressive Kentucky heat bearing down on the town, her husband, thinking she had died, had buried her quickly. But here's where it gets so disturbing. Shortly after her funeral, other townspeople began experiencing the same illness, and many of them woke up. Octavia's husband panicked. He had her exhumed, hoping against hope she was still alive. But she wasn't. What he did find made the blood drain from his face. Octavia's body had shifted. Her nails were broken and bloodied. The lining of her coffin was torn to shreds. She had woken up, and she had been buried alive. And the tragedy was compounded by her final moments. Panicked, trapped, suffocating, wearing the dress she had once intended to wear on her wedding day. Now, if a young woman died before she could marry, families would often dress her in her bridal gown before burial. It was seen as a symbol of purity, of innocence, and of untouched potential. To them, the white dress wasn't just a costume. It was a tribute to what could have been. They were called bride burials. And while the image may seem beautiful on the surface, there's something deeply haunting about it. Because that woman didn't get to choose. She didn't say yes, and she didn't walk down the aisle. She didn't vow anything. But she was still dressed up and buried like a doll. And that unsettling truth leads us to one of the most horrifying questions of all. What if they weren't dead? See, these Victorian bride burials happened at the same time people were developing safety coffins. Yup, coffins with bells, air pipes, escape hatches, and even windows built into them. Because medical science in the 1800s, it wasn't great. And it turns out, a lot of people were terrified of being buried alive. I mean, they had good reason to be. Epilepsy, cholera, certain fevers, these could all make a person appear dead. There would be no heartbeat, no breath, their eyes would remain closed, and their body would stay still. Especially in women, who were often described as faint or delicate. And when that happened, if a doctor wasn't thorough, or the family rushed the burial, into the ground she went, still in her dress, still clutching flowers, sometimes still alive. Alright, we love to imagine on this channel. So let's step back to the 19th century and imagine you're walking through a graveyard at dusk. It's quiet, it's foggy, but if you look closely, you'll see something strange. Tiny ropes running from certain graves up to the wooden poles with bells on top. Now, these weren't for decoration and they weren't for prayer. These were called emergency alarms connected to the fingers of the person buried below. If they woke up underground, they could move their hand and ring the bell and hope someone was nearby to hear it. It sounds like something out of a Gothic novel, but it's completely real. People were so terrified of premature burial that inventors filed patents for all kinds of life-saving coffins. And as I mentioned before, some had windows so you could peer in without opening the casket. A few even had feeding tubes, like just in case you had to be down there a while and wanted a snack. But here's the part that really gets me. There were real graveyard watchers, people whose actual job was to walk the cemetery at night and listen. Can you imagine that? It's pitch black. You're walking past rows of silent graves. The only sound is the crunch of leaves underfoot. And then, would you run? Or would you dig? I mean, you should probably dig if that's what you're getting paid to do, though, right? Okay. Now let me tell you the story of Margorie McCall, who may just be the original corpse bride. Okay, so in the early 1700s, Margorie was declared dead in Lurgan, Ireland. She was buried quickly, like many were at the time, and she happened to be wearing a rather expensive ring, one her husband couldn't remove due to swelling. So, naturally, a few grave robbers saw this as an opportunity. They snuck into the cemetery one night and dug her up. But when they tried to remove the ring, Margorie woke up, screaming. The men? Obviously, they took off running, terrified out of their minds. And Margorie? She walked home. Legend has it that her husband fainted when he opened the door, and she went on to live for years after, eventually being buried again, but for real this time. Her headstone reads, "Lived once, buried twice." Now, whether every detail of the story is true or a ghost-tinted retelling, we do know this much. Cases like hers, they weren't uncommon, especially among young women whose lives were already tightly controlled. If a man was mostly dead, people waited. If a woman fainted and didn't rouse, she was often written off. Delicate, emotional, gone too soon. And the bridal gown just made it all the more poetic for everyone but her. But let's take this a little bit further, shall we? Because there were moments in history where people didn't just bury women in bridal gowns. They actually married them after death. If a fiancé died before the wedding, the surviving partner could still legally marry them, with approval from the president, of course. It was seen as an act of honor, a way to preserve love that had been interrupted by tragedy. And it didn't just happen during wartime. One of the most chilling examples? A woman whose fiancé died in a car crash just weeks before their wedding. She showed up to City Hall in her white gown, accompanied by his parents. And then she legally became his widow the same day she became his bride. Meanwhile, across the world, countries like China have practiced ghost marriages for centuries, where two deceased people, or a living person and a corpse, are symbolically married to maintain cosmic balance. And yes, there were rumors of grave robbing tied to this. Stories of women's bodies stolen from graves and sold for these ceremonies. Imagine being a woman in that world. You weren't safe in life, and apparently you weren't safe in death either. It's easy to romanticize the image of the corpse bride. We've seen it in movies. The Corpse Bride, Crimson Peak, even, my personal favorite, Penny Dreadful. A Gothic girl in white, bathed in moonlight, forever waiting at the altar. But the real history behind this, it's a lot darker. Because what looks beautiful on the surface, roses, lace, a porcelain expression, often masks a story of silence, of choices stolen, of a young woman buried before she was ready, whether by illness or by mistake. Sometimes she was literally alive. So there's a reason these stories stay with us. There's something deeply primal about the idea of being buried too soon, of screaming in the dark and no one hearing you, of being locked into a role, whether it's wife or bride or corpse, before you had the chance to become anything else. And in these stories of lace-covered coffins and ringing graveyard bells, we're reminded that horror isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, dressed in white, and forgotten underground. Thank you so much for watching. This is Danie Dreadful reminding you that every story holds a hint of truth or a shadow of a legend. Until next time, stay curious and keep the lights on.